Thank you very much. One of the first things I have to say quickly is that brigadier doesn't mean brigadier. One of the things about Wikipedia is it seems to be determined to use that. In the Royal Company of Archers, the Queen's Bodyguard of Scotland, the brigadier is the lowest rank in the army. My brief is to talk about UAVs and strategic thought. Thanks, I think, to Carl Eric, I'm credited with comparing their significance to the significance of the atomic bomb and its role on strategic thought. I apologize for literally walking into this conference as you're all about to go home. And that's been a source of both of worry and a source of relief to me. The worry has been that I'm about to speak to you on a subject which you've been thinking very hard about for 2 days and which I've been thinking about for the last 2 hours in the aeroplane. And the source of relief is that I haven't had to hear all the skepticism and abuse that has been thrown at me in my absence as a result of this comparison between UAVs and nuclear weapons. If I say things that you've already thought of, then I shall not be remotely surprised. And if I do end up repeating, well, maybe that's an appropriate thing to do at the end of a conference. So let me say that I too, I feel skeptical about the relationship between UAVs and strategic thought, and the notion that there is a significance comparable with that of the atomic bomb. When I said it, I'm sure I must have said it with a question mark at the end. It must have been a way of provoking debate. And I hope that what follows will at least lead me, and perhaps you, to reflect on what the implications are for strategic thought. What I want to do, self-evidently, therefore, is to pose some questions rather more than to give you answers, not least because if we don't have any sensible questions, we certainly won't have any sensible answers. I know that's not always true for the military. The military like quick answers, but the role of academics is to challenge those answers. At bottom, it seems to me that UAVs are a technological response to a series of tactical and operational problems in warfare. Moreover, the solutions they present to those problems are not particularly new. I said just now I hadn't been thinking about these things for the last 48 hours. It's not quite true. Fortunately, a student of mine who is working on them came to see me yesterday, Ulrika Franke, and she and I discussed UAVs for at least an hour yesterday, rather less than you've discussed them for. One of the points that she made to me is the pursuit of unmanned flight is at least as old as the pursuit of manned flight. And indeed, the two things have largely developed side by side and in step with each other. Military forces have wanted to use unmanned flight for two principal reasons. First of all, self-evidently for the purposes of reconnaissance, to acquire intelligence, and secondly, to be able to deliver lethal fire directly onto a target, ideally at some considerable distance from that target. And indeed, there's nothing very striking or different about that from most of the other developments that have taken place in warfare, certainly during the course of the 20th century and into the early 21st century. UAVs have therefore done and are doing little in war that is different from what manned aircraft and manned flight have also aspired to do. And indeed, we have used other devices which have also been unmanned and passed through the air to achieve the same effects, from artillery shells to cruise missiles. And perhaps we should think of both of them, artillery shells and cruise missiles, also as unmanned aerial vehicles, because surely they are. Finding out where the enemy is, who he is, what positions he's adopted, and then trying to kill him at a distance have been imperatives in war for a very long time. So from all that point of view, in these respects, UAVs are enablers, and they are enablers without direct strategic effects. They are designed to enhance the means to achieve the objectives which you are aiming for, without themselves affecting directly, necessarily, the relationships between means, ways, and ends, which I would see as the core of what strategy is about. And all that is relatively unsurprising. What technological change has tended to do to warfare has to enhance the component parts of strategy, not to dominate it as a whole, and especially not to dominate it in the context of land warfare. Classical strategic thought, by which I mean Clausewitz and Jomini, say, in relation to land warfare, or Mahan and Corbett in relation to war at sea, was not much influenced, at least in its traditional senses, by material change. It was much more influenced by geography and by social and political conditions. And for the classical strategic thinkers, the dialogue in strategic thought is a dialogue between the present and the past. There is much more attention to history than there is to the future. But since the First World War, and especially during the latter part of the 20th century, there has been a counter-school of strategic thought, what we might call a materialist school, which is indeed inspired by the advent of new technology, and where the dialogue, instead of being between the past and the present, or the present and the past, is instead a dialogue between the present and a potentially perfectible future. That school of thought has flourished particularly in the context of naval and air warfare, because, of course, both navies and air forces are built primarily around their equipment, and technological changes to ships and to aircraft have the capacity to change dramatically the core relationship between time and space, that central relationship within strategy itself. So here, in the air and on the sea, new technologies, rather than being force multipliers, which is how armies tend to see them, but can have the potential to become revolutionary in strategy. To take some obvious historical examples, in the 19th century, the steamship changed man's relationship to the physical constants of the sea, overcoming winds and tides, and enabling ships to fight not necessarily close to the shore or in narrow seas, but also on the open oceans. And in the 20th century, as you all know perfectly well, the manned aircraft spawned the ambition of what was called strategic bombing. And in due course, of course, the atomic bomb led to the hope that nuclear deterrence could go even further and could reshape international relations themselves. So if UAVs today bear comparison with the atomic bomb, it is not least in that sort of ambition, in that almost rhetorical and political effect, in their capacity, at least as some would believe, and it is fashionable to believe, in their capacity to achieve the same sort of effects as the advocate of the bomber or the advocate of nuclear weapons aspired for those two weapon systems. The belief that here's a weapon which can be perfected and which can almost eliminate the reactions of the enemy from strategic thought, can remove the biggest complexity we have when we think about strategy, which is that it's not entirely under our own control, but depends on our relationship with our adversary. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. Now, UAVs are, of course, the center of a great deal of press comment and public attention, which is precisely why you've been addressing them for the last 2 days. So much so that that fact is in itself, I would argue, a big part of the case for saying that UAVs have strategic effects. If the press and the public, outside the context of Air Force academies, themselves debate the pros and cons of a weapon system, then that weapon system has an effect on strategy almost by definition, because it's disseminated itself into a public and political discourse. The obvious recent comparison would be the way in which another tactical system, that is improvised explosive devices, IEDs, had sufficient effect on the armed forces deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan to make the casualties they inflicted, which should simply have been of tactical effect, of a wider political and public significance to the point that they have influenced the debate over deployment in those theatres of war in themselves. But the reasons for the public debate are less to do with the strategic effects of UAVs than with the legal and moral implications of their use. If you open any paper, that, of course, is where the discussion is focused. And it is there for a very obvious reason. The argument that UAVs have changed the face of warfare rests not on that simple proposition in itself, but on the idea that the United States in particular has used them against those it identifies as actual or even only potential terrorists in a country which is not in an area of war, not within its area of operations, and in defiance of that country's state sovereignty. I'm not saying that because the debate has been primarily about international law, that does not mean international law does not have strategic effects. Increasingly, both international law and just war theory do directly shape strategy, not least within NATO and within the West. But if the key issue is whether the United States is right to breach the state sovereignty of Pakistan in its pursuit of the Taliban or of the leaders of al-Qaeda, then exactly the same questions would arise if it elected to strike those same targets with any other form of cross-border fire, whether it decided to situate an artillery battery on the Afghan side of the Pakistan border and fire shells across, or whether it decided to send manned aircraft to drop bombs, or even whether it decided to use cruise missiles to take out those it deemed to be Taliban targets. There are three principal lines of attack directed at UAVs on legal and moral grounds. The first criticism, and the most absurd, is the accusation that they kill the enemy at a distance, as though that's somehow improper, that the real way to kill your enemy is in hand-to-hand combat. You should have told that to Henry V at Agincourt in 1415, when, of course, he thought it was more sensible to try and kill the French knights with archers. Or you should have told that to Lord Kitchener when he fought the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 in the Sudan, when he managed to inflict roughly 10,000 casualties on the Sudanese dervishes at the cost of 47 on his own side, largely through the use of superior firepower. If you can kill at a distance, it seems not a bad thing to be able to do. There is no inherent, it seems to me, moral presumption that you put yourself in harm's way in order to put the enemy in harm's way. The second criticism that is levelled at UAVs is that they kill non-combatants through the collateral damage they inflict. This too seems to me an inherently pretty absurd argument. It's not to say that it's not true. It's not to say that non-combatants haven't been killed by UAVs, because self-evidently they have. But the whole point of using UAVs is that they are more precise than is the use of a gravity bomb. The argument, of course, is that fewer non-combatants, and it is precisely the moral and legal pressures not to kill non-combatants, that fewer non-combatants are killed than would be the case if there any other method of warfare. Fewer non-combatants in Pakistan are killed by using UAVs than were killed, say, by the Allied blockade of Germany in the First World War or by the strategic bombing campaign of the Second World War. Moreover, if non-combatants are killed, the problem or the reason for their being killed probably lies less with the UAV itself, with the weapon, than with the intelligence that has been used to target that weapon in the first place. And finally, and this seems to me to go to the heart of the strategic problem, and it follows from all the things I've just said in the first 2 points, the third point, the third criticism, levelled at UAVs on legal and moral grounds, is that killing at a distance removes one of the cardinal aspects of the definition of war, that it is based on reciprocity, that to that extent, the ideal of hand-to-hand combat is an important part of our understanding of war. If you remember, as I hope you all will, the opening chapter of Clausewitz's On War, chapter 1, almost line 1, war is a clash of wills. The essence of war is that it lies in that relationship between the two adversaries. And the attraction, of course, of our current understanding of UAVs, for those who use them, is it removes, as best you can, that element of reciprocity. If that last point were genuinely true and likely to be a permanently conditioning factor within warfare, then I think indeed the case for UAVs affecting a revolution in strategy would be much stronger. But I believe it simply is not likely to be the case, and I'm not sure it is even the case today. What that does, the argument, the presumption that UAVs somehow remove the element of reciprocity in war, what that does is generalize from the particular circumstances of their current use within Afghanistan and Pakistan, and particularly their use from Afghanistan into Pakistan, and their current use by the US, as though that were a rule for all time. It runs the risk that so many of us run whenever we think about current warfare, which is generalized from the current experience as though it were universally true. UAVs do, of course, currently confer a unilateral advantage on the United States and on the allies of the United States, and that advantage is self-evident in the AFPAC, a phrase I hate, in the AFPAC theatre of war. But the presumption that what is currently true will be permanently true is a besetting sin of strategic thought. And I think it already misrepresents the situation with regard to UAVs. First of all, there are extraordinarily simple responses to UAVs which are already effective. Even sophisticated air defense systems can bring UAVs down. And on the commercial market, you will find surface-to-air missile systems advertised which precisely have that quality, that they're good at bringing down UAVs. UAV systems can be hacked, as Hezbollah has already done in the cases of the IDF, and of course as Iraqi insurgents have done in the case of the United States. Iran claims that in December 2012, its electronic warfare unit took control of a US Sentinel UAV and landed it safely, although the United States has disputed that. The point is not that the UAV is invulnerable. It is rather the reverse. The point is that the UAV's vulnerability is a cost with which its operators can live because there is no pilot and therefore no life is lost when the UAV comes down. The UAV is expendable. The cost, of course, will be less sustainable the more sophisticated, capable, and expensive the UAV becomes. And the second point about this issue of reciprocity in war and whether it's there is that currently between 70 and 80 countries in the world have UAVs and have the capacity to operate them. In other words, what is extraordinary about the theatre of war that we're currently concerned with, Afghanistan and Pakistan, is that it is exceptional in almost every other part of the world, and particularly if there were any interstate conflict, reciprocity would be inherent in UAV warfare, and that trend is only likely to increase rather than diminish. So this seems to me to be a classic case of where an initial monopoly in a capability has generated exaggerated expectations of the strategic as opposed to the tactical and operational consequences of its procurement. There is indeed some sort of parallel here with the acquisition of atomic bombs. If you think of the responses in 1945 to the dropping of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most of those responses tended to absorb the atomic bomb within existing strategic thought, to see it as part of and the perfection of the notion of strategic bombing, a sort of super bomb, which confirmed that doctrine. The technology, in other words, was applied without all that much in the way of serious strategic thought. Now, of course, that self-evidently was not universally true. Most conspicuously, of course, in 1946, Bernard Brodie argued in The Absolute Weapon that things had changed irreversibly, that the object of strategy was now to avoid war and not to wage it. But the fully developed nostrums of nuclear deterrence were not evident until the late 1950s or even the early 1960s. And that sophisticated strategic theory, the theory of deterrence that came out of the digesting of this new technology, now, of course, looks extraordinarily overblown and disproportionate for what is really a very simple proposition, and for which in many of our countries seems to have relatively little relevance. UAVs, whose technological evolution has actually occurred over a much longer period than the 1940s equivalent of atomic bombs, have today, if you like, reached that point where suddenly strategic thought has woken up to something that's been around for rather a long time, just as strategic thought woke up to nuclear weapons in the late 1950s, and now that thought is struggling to catch up with the capability. But it's not enough just to say that the dust will settle, which is the drift of all the things I've said so far, and that UAVs will simply be seen as enablers, as giving tactical and operational added-on factors, if you like, at some points into the future. I think there are two aspects of the current debate which do have strategic effects and which are important for us to think about in a much broader context and may even conceivably be described as revolutionary in their effects on strategy. The first is it matters enormously that the country striking Pakistan with impunity, the country breaching Pakistan's state sovereignty with the use of UAVs, is the United States. It matters precisely because the United States, and particularly the Obama administration, have the capacity to set the international debate on strategy, which is vouchsafed to no other country. If it were not for American use, I suspect we wouldn't be here today talking about the subject. In other words, it requires America to do this for NATO and the wider world to begin to wake up. And also because the United States is itself seeing the use of UAVs as a strategy. I didn't entirely waste my time on the aeroplane this morning. I began by reading The Guardian to show how liberal and left-wing my opinions are, the London press. And The Guardian today carries a report derived from the Washington Post's revelation yesterday that the US has a secret CIA drone base in Saudi Arabia. And in that report, it describes John Brennan, Obama's nomination for the directorship of the CIA, as the architect, these are its words, the architect of the White House strategy on drones. And I use the word, self-evidently, I use the word advisedly. Indeed, that point, that Brennan and, of course, the nominee to be Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, see UAVs as the core of American strategy in waging what is now called the long war rather than the global war on terror, has been made by many commentators in the press over the last few weeks. And that, of course, is the selling point, both of Brennan and of Hagel, for Obama. Obama, even more than Bush, has ramped up drone strikes against terrorists, not only in Pakistan, but also, of course, in Somalia and Yemen. Just as he, of course, is effecting the corollary of that policy as he would see it, which is the bringing down of troop numbers in Afghanistan and the commitment to the withdrawal from Afghanistan itself by 2014. So this is a key point, that actually we are seeing a shift in strategy which does put UAVs at the center of what the United States is trying to do, and which is essentially seeing UAVs as having the capacity to replace manpower-intensive counterinsurgency doctrine, enabling the United States to fight its wars at a distance with increasing levels of impunity and without incurring the financial costs of deploying forces forward or incurring, of course, the casualties that might arise from such deployments. Having troops on the ground has increasingly lost utility since Obama first came to office in 2009. And it has lost utility because, of course, the war that the United States finds itself fighting in Afghanistan has lost its popularity. It has moved from being a war of necessity, which is what it was seen to be in 2002, to being a war of choice. And UAVs are therefore a way to restore utility to war, to make war useful, to make it once again an instrument of policy. But they do so at a significant risk. What they are doing is what the German military historian and friends of mine who look at the March 1918 offensives in the spring on the Western Front towards the end of the First World War, what they would say of Ludendorff, that is to say that he was indulging in the tacticization of strategy. Horrible phrase, but it captures what I'm trying to say, which is the tendency for those who should be exercising strategic authority, who should be trying to think about how you link war to policy, to pursue instead the tactical detail, to narrow the focus down and lose the context. The Guardian report goes on to say how each Tuesday Obama approves the lists of targets for that week, reducing essentially the long war, the global war on terror, if you still want to call it that, though Obama obviously doesn't, to a series of individual tactical decisions. Moreover, whether it will restore utility to war is, it seems to me, very much open to doubt. And that is for one very practical reason. And that is that UAVs don't, in fact, remove the need for people to be on the ground or to be in the theatre of war. Most UAVs are deployed in theatre, not at a distance. And of course, UAVs themselves depend on human intelligence as much as other forms of intelligence in order to be discriminate in their use. I think it is also problematic for a much more serious reason. UAVs are currently achieving their destructive effects in the campaign on terror and in the war in Afghanistan by decapitating the leadership of the Taliban. In that respect, they are carrying through the ideas evident in war power theory, for example, as advocated by John Warden in relation to the use of air power in the first Gulf War. But in case you hadn't noticed, the effect of decapitation is to remove people's heads. And in this case, it means the heads of the Taliban. With whom are you going to negotiate if you wish to bring war to an end? That was always recognized in traditional thinking about war as a reason for not targeting heads of state. You needed somebody with whom to negotiate in order to establish the terms of the peace. And I've been told that one of the problems, and some of you here may know much better than I, is that actually the difficulty at the moment is identifying with whom you should negotiate in relation to the Taliban. That roughly 13 out of 20 of the most senior Taliban leaders have been killed, either by UAVs or by special forces, and without a leadership, the Taliban cannot engage in peace talks. Indeed, we have an irony that as the 2014 deadline approaches, so negotiations with the Taliban have foundered. And without negotiation, what do we confront? We confront endless war, and endless war seems to me the very negation of what strategy is about. Another negation to go alongside the tacticization of strategy which UAVs might achieve. This is a generic consequence of giving UAVs a role in shaping strategy. But the pressure, therefore, not to use UAVs, because they may have strategic effects, has to deal with another aspect of the case for their use. UAVs are, of course, enormously attractive to states like ours, the states of the Western world, which have abandoned the notion of the mass army, even if there is still conscription here in Norway, and yet which still have an appetite for intervention. Sustained counterinsurgency requires mass on the ground, and yet our armies no longer have mass. And we no longer have the appetite to maintain that mass, either because it costs too much or because we are unwilling to conscript. What UAVs currently do is overcome a number of constraints which currently inhibit ground operations. They ensure that casualties to our own troops are low, if not non-existent. When a British army goes out on patrol in Afghanistan today, its first requirement is its own security. And if one of the members of its own patrol is hit, then the evacuation of the casualty takes priority over any other mission that that patrol is designed to achieve. The UAV gets over that problem. Secondly, UAVs ensure what in British parlance, and forgive me because I don't know what the Norwegian equivalent would be, but what in British parlance are called harmony guidelines. And harmony guidelines are actually a requirement, which are frequently breached, of course, that British armed force personnel, service personnel, will be at home with their families so many nights in the year. Clearly, if you can operate UAVs from the rear, you can be at home with your families so many nights in the year. Harmony guidelines are going to be easier to observe. And thirdly, UAVs overcome the disruption and loss of continuity in theatre, which is created by the prevalence of 6-month, or even in the Americans' case, of 12-month tours which fail to produce persistence and continuity because of a wholesale turnover in the personnel who are actually doing the fighting in theatre. What UAVs allow for is the possibility of trickle posting rather than wholesale unit removal, and of course the UAVs themselves have a degree of persistence in their capacity to remain in the air. So UAVs enable us, it would seem, to reshape war in the light of our own needs and expectations. It is interesting in this respect how, of course, the report in the Washington Post is about the CIA's use of drones, of UAVs, not about the armed forces' use of UAVs. That this is actually about a process through which traditional armed forces are to be marginalized in favor of intelligence services and special forces. Clausewitz famously described war as being made up of 3 elements: passion, the play of probability and chance, and logic. And he then went on to associate that trinity with the people, the armed forces, and the government. The challenge for most states over the last decade has been to recognize the role of the people in making strategy. It has always been very easy in the debates on civil-military relations to see strategy as a dialogue between generals and politicians. What has become evident in the last decade in Western societies is the need to incorporate the people. And I don't just mean war among the people as Rupert Smith has described it, the people who are in the theatre of war, but also the need to engage the people at home. When Obama, and when in my own country David Cameron, addresses the issue of strategy in Afghanistan, he is talking to a domestic audience, not to the people of Afghanistan or even to the government of Afghanistan. Cameron memorably said a couple of years ago that Britain would be out of Afghanistan by 2014 because the British people expected it, as though that was a strategic condition. And of course, if he says it is as a head of state, it does effectively become a strategic condition. What UAVs seem to permit is they allow governments to use force without having too much engagement with their people, without having to explain to their people what they're doing. And indeed, even more beautifully, without having too much engagement with our armed forces, if actually the implementation and the application of UAVs is to lie with the CIA and its equivalents. So the whole business seems to be, from a politician's point of view, made in heaven. No inconvenient arguments for generals, and no having to appease your own domestic public. It is a form of ideal warfare, almost indeed war by trial of single combat, a nightly duel. But the point remains that war is a reciprocal activity. If war is a reciprocal activity, then just as their leaders, the enemy's leaders, can be targeted, so in due course ours will be too. And the problem, of course, will not stop there, because we are the electorates that put those people into power in the first place, and we will be held accountable for our leaders' actions. So will that much really have changed when the dust settles? My argument would be, in relation to strategic theory, not much. In relation to strategy in practice, perhaps there will be some change. But that is because strategy in practice is shaped by politicians and their imperatives, and not by generals and classical strategic theory. Thank you very much.